Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. Have you ever felt that beauty enriches your life in a way that's not easy to explain? Today we'll be looking at how beauty fits into Platonic love, and we'll see that it plays an essential role in that. And since, as we've seen, Plato's theory of love is meant to explain not just one aspect of our emotional or inner lives, but desire as such, we'll see that beauty, or perhaps rather an openness to it, is actually extremely important to human life as such. For Plato, it's not just some kind of nice to have, but essential to what we would now call human flourishing or realizing our potential. And it's absolutely essential to that existential or deep hope that is, of course, one of the main themes of this series. So this idea about beauty is basically all coming from one passage of this Platonic dialogue we've been looking at, the Phaedrus. And that passage relates that story of the psyche or soul that I started talking about a few episodes ago. The myth that starts out by talking about the primal, or in a way natural, state of the psyche to be winged and in the company of the gods in heaven. But then, of course, there's this fall of the psyche, and the overarching theme of this fall, of course, is that it's a tragedy. It's at once a misfortune that befalls the soul, but it also gives us an insight into humanity's great flaw, a desire for pure autonomy that ends up putting it into this state of alienation, both from itself and from reality, from, you could say, the most real things, from the truth of things. When this happens, the psyche loses its wings, its freedom, its ability to be better and happier, because the fall is accompanied by a forgetting of its former life, a forgetting of these principles of reality, goodness and unity. So, and we've seen how for Plato these things are kind of interchangeable with beauty, Plato and the Platonic tradition. So we might seem to be in kind of a hopeless situation, but as we'll be seeing today, that is actually not the case, thanks to one thing, and that is the nature of forgetting. The key thing here is that forgetting something isn't the same thing as simply not knowing it. Forgetting is not the mere erasure of memory, like the deletion of a computer file. It leaves us in a state of both knowing and not knowing, in this kind of twilight state. What I mean by that is it leaves us in a state in which, although we might not be able to bring the forgotten thing to mind by an effort of our will, it can nevertheless be awoken by external stimuli. Certain things can jog our memory. It's as though the forgotten thing lives in a kind of potential existence until it's actualized by some sort of external trigger. Now, one thing that may be coming to you is that we often think of such buried memories and such triggers as unpleasant, if not extremely so, if we're thinking about memories of trauma. And an explanation of this phenomenon and the devising of a means to treat it were, of course, among the greatest of the contributions to humanity of Sigmund Freud. For Freud, the suppression of such memories means a kind of fracturing of the psyche, because as long as these memories were suppressed, they would manifest themselves in the form of irrational responses of various kinds that cause the greatest suffering. And so for him, the greatest discontent of civilization was always self-dividedness, the state of psychic self-division, of being bewildered and in a way at odds with our responses, our unthinking responses to events that we find ourselves in when we have unprocessed trauma. And of course, I think we all do to some extent. It's really the human condition to have this unprocessed stuff. But some unfortunate people, of course, just have it much more in a much more extreme form than others. So this vital task of reintegrating the psyche, restoring it to unity, requires bringing these buried experiences back to consciousness, something Freud initially tried to achieve using hypnosis, actually. We see this explained in one of his earliest works, his 1895 Studies on Hysteria, which he co-wrote with his colleague Joseph Breuer. And I quote here Jonathan Lear's 2005 book, which I've quoted before in this series. It's titled simply Freud. And Lear writes, "Under hypnosis, it was revealed that there was a memory of a past event that was split off from conscious awareness and was active in causing symptoms." And Lear then quotes Freud's and Breuer's book. And they say, "We must presume that the psychical trauma, or more precisely, the memory of the trauma, acts like a foreign body, which long after its entry must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work." Freud and Breuer felt they could heal this internal rift and reintegrate the psyche and eliminate this element of foreignness in it by getting the patient to talk through and, in some sense, relive the traumatic event. And they called this process catharsis. They called it cathartic, from the Greek word, as we saw, for purification. They defined catharsis as, quote, "the process of reducing or eliminating a complex by recalling it to conscious awareness and allowing it to be expressed. For we found, to our great surprise at first," they wrote, "that each individual hysterical symptom immediately and permanently disappeared when we had succeeded in bringing clearly to light the memory of the event by which it was provoked." So this was 130 years ago, and much of what Freud wrote has been discredited. But there's a certain basic structure in this theory, I think, that remains. We know that people who have suffered from trauma experience flashbacks that trigger their memories of the event, often in ways of which they're not conscious or not entirely conscious. Because people in these triggered situations often aren't aware or fully aware of what's going on. They, or we all in some way, really, can react in ways that don't seem appropriate to the actual situation, to the extent that we can be bewildered by these responses and feel that anxiety that comes with a sense of being divided against ourselves. And of course, many of us, perhaps all of us in one way or another, turn to addictions and compulsions of various kinds. And there are, just myriads of them. Myriad forms of self-destructive and other destructive habits to try to cope with the anxiety. And not just individually, but these things also, of course, take these communal forms that we've looked at in earlier episodes. And this can actually mean a kind of downward spiral, a vicious circle of progressively more intense self-dividedness or self-separation. So what does all this have to do with Platonic love and Socrates' myth of the soul? I actually think quite a lot. There's something important going on in Plato's myth in the Phaedrus that I'm not sure enough attention has been paid to, and that is that the erotic experience he describes of the fallen or human soul, its encounters with beauty, which is the trigger of eros, look an awful lot like the experience of the traumatized psyche, except turned on its head. It's as though beauty is the anti-trauma. And here's what I mean. After describing the fall or embodiment of the psyche, which, as we saw last time, is really its forgetfulness of the ecstatic caused by its desire for autonomy, Socrates goes on to talk about this crucial element of forgetting that I mentioned a few minutes ago. We have all forgotten this primal ecstatic condition of the psyche that we saw Socrates describe so beautifully 3 episodes ago. Quote, "We gazed in rapture at sacred revealed objects that were perfect and simple and unshakable and blissful. That was the ultimate vision. And we saw it in pure light because we were pure ourselves." But forgetting, as we saw, is not a simple erasure of knowledge. Something remains latent, wanting to be actualized. And it is beauty, the spur of eros, that does the actualizing. Beauty, Plato writes, was radiant among the other objects, and now that we have come down here, we grasp it sparkling through the clearest of our senses. Mostly vision, he means. But what we see is that erotic experiences, these intense encounters with beauty, have a lot in common with moments of triggeredness. Socrates tells Phaedrus that when an embodied soul glimpses beauty, that soul is reminded of the pure beauty it knew in its former life. But because this memory is buried, these encounters leave those who experience them bewildered and out of their heads. These experiences give rise to extreme emotional responses that appear irrational, both to those experiencing them and to others. People encountering beauty, he says, quote, "are startled when they see an image of what they saw up there. Then they are beside themselves, and their experience is beyond their comprehension because they cannot fully grasp what it is they are seeing." So these experiences are oddly similar, and yet in some crucial respects they're opposed. As trauma is intensely unpleasant, beauty is intensely pleasant. And while trauma can lead the psyche to greater self-dividedness, beauty can restore it to unity, Socrates says. The soul has the capacity to reintegrate itself, or perhaps better, be reintegrated, through a progressive process of recollection, the reliving of its original bliss, and the rediscovery of oneness through the articulation or conceptualization of that ultimate object of its desire that triggered it. Or perhaps we could say a reflection of which triggered it. Socrates tells Glaucon, quote, "A human being must understand speech in terms of general forms, proceeding to bring many perceptions together into a reasoned unity. That process is the recollection of the things our soul saw when it was traveling with the God." Unquote. And because this process of recollection is actually the deepest desire of the psyche, Socrates adds desire or eros to the list of forms of madness or mania sent by the gods that he mentioned earlier. And he calls it the fourth of them, but it's really the sort of one ring to rule them all. It's like the overarching form of mania, of which the others are it's the overarching mania of which the others are really just manifestations. In fact, the remainder of his myth is really a description of the psyche's repeated encounter with beauty in a way that enables or spurs its progressive reintegration with itself and with the principle of reality. It's a virtuous circle, an increasing capacity of the psyche, you might say, to elevate itself, which Socrates depicts in this wonderful image of the soul gradually regrowing its wings. And for Plato, as for Freud, this is a cathartic process, one that heals the psyche by reunifying it. The soul's disaster falls upon it when it ceases to dwell in the perfect beauty, Plotinus tells us, at least in the rendering of that great Irish translator of Plotinus, Stephen McKenna, a contemporary of Freud. It's arguably a somewhat liberal translation. The more recent translation by Lloyd Gerson and his colleagues translates that Greek word pathos, not as disaster, but sort of more neutrally as experience. But it conveys beautifully, I think, this great Platonic principle that beauty in all its forms, and we'll see that ultimately the great beauty we're seeking is not a physical one, which was also, by the way, I think, perhaps the central message of that Italian movie that came out a few years ago, La Grande Bellezza, the great beauty. Beauty is not a kind of nice addendum to life, but in some way the very essence of it. And that if we want to live better lives, we must open ourselves up as much as we can every day to the experience of beauty. And we also saw this same theme, of course, much earlier in this series when we looked at Marcel Proust's ostensibly, and I guess at least to some extent, fictional, maybe I should say, fictional but perhaps not fictitious work, In Search of Lost Time. The main character's vision of the fundamental beauty, or if you like, unity of life, played this dramatic and life-changing, perhaps actually life-saving role. It really kind of turned his life around and made him look at life in a different way. Actually, I don't think these experiences need to happen as dramatically as both Plato and Proust depict them for beauty to do its work on us. Taken in a kind of literal way, Socrates is talking in this speech about encounters with a beautiful person with whom one is sexually infatuated. But I think we're to understand that beauty in all its myriad forms works on us in essentially the same way. And we're to understand the same kind of therapy can be worked in our encounters with beauty in all its myriad forms. And I think we probably do have encounters with beauty in a way routinely, but we don't always allow it to do its work on us because we don't always know how to handle it. We don't really understand its full significance. Or perhaps to basically put these things in another way, we don't always have at our disposal the means to make ourselves fully open to it. But that's what I hope to talk about later in this series. And another thing you may remember is I promised to try to translate Plato's language of myth, of reincarnation, and a psyche that is described, as I mentioned last time, in this sort of quasi-bodily terms as something that flits in and out of bodies. To translate that into language that is in a way more palatable to us in the 21st century. Is there a way to do that, to translate it faithfully? I think so. And that's what I'll be attempting next time. Anyway, I hope to see you then. And until then, be well, and thanks for watching.